All right, so today is Friday, March 31st, 2023. My name is Emily Ma, and I'm here with Bennie Flores Ansell for the Houston Asian American Archive at Rice. So to start from the very beginning, could you tell us where and when you were born?
Yes, I was born in Manila, Philippines, on January 5th, 1967. And I only lived there for 6 months, and my father relocated us to Connecticut.
And how would you describe your family household that you grew up in?
So my father was an architect, and my mother was a stay-at-home mom, and she was a Sunday painter, but she was also very interested in fashion. So I think I get sort of a lot of my interest from that. And I think they were very design oriented. And I think because my father was an architect, he thought about how things functioned a lot. When we would go on vacations, we would look at art, we would look at architecture. They both loved music very much. And I think I have fond memories of them just pointing out beauty in the everyday. One time we were driving, it was wintertime, and there was like a hill. And this is just a weird memory I just thought of that they saw just all the sort of the red lights going up, and they thought, isn't that beautiful? And I just sort of thought, wow. So whenever I see that, I think of them, and I think of sort of moments like that where they would do that in terms of pointing things out from the everyday that are just beautiful, which probably attributed to me becoming an artist and seeing things a little bit differently. I also had 7 brothers. I'm the 7th, and I'm the only girl. And it was, as you can imagine, with 8 kids, it was a pretty loud household with lots of boys. My mom was an amazing cook, and we had dinner together every night, which was pretty fantastic.
Wow, that sounds kind of chaotic, but also
Yes.
very Were you the oldest out of them?
I was the 7th.
Oh, the youngest.
Yeah, well, no, there was one. They tried one more time for another girl, and they got a boy.
Oh,
So I had 6 older brothers and 1 younger. Yes.
I see. Do you have any favorite memories with your siblings?
I think I became a photographer probably because of my oldest brother, Ben. He took a photography class in high school, and I just remembered seeing him with his camera and seeing the film, and him telling me about the process, how he would process it, and then how he would actually make his own prints and then come back and show me. And I just sort of thought that that was a pretty powerful tool. So I think that that kind of led me down the path of becoming a photographer and seeing that at a young age. And my father was very much into cameras too. Any of the new technologies that were out, he had an 8mm camera. We have a lot of family films that are shot. And when I look at them now, I see how they were artistically shot as far as his panning and his zooming. And, I'm grateful for his love of photography too, my father, because we have a lot of amazing images from when I was younger.
That's so cool that your family kind of shaped your artistic journey as well.
Yes, definitely.
And I understand that you were just a baby at the time, so you probably don't remember much, but did your parents ever tell you any stories later about your family's immigration from the Philippines to Connecticut?
I think it's really interesting, having 6 older brothers, my youngest brother was born here. So I have one brother that was actually American, born in the States. But I think it was hard. I think now that I'm an adult, I think they kind of didn't really tell us that. I think they made some conscious decisions, leaving the Philippines because of Marcos coming into law. And I think my father was the first of his siblings to leave. I think he sort of saw what was happening in the corruption, and he wanted to leave that. And my father's uncle owned a movie theater in Manila. So since he was a young child, he sort of ingested the American culture through movies and everything. So I think he had this idealized notion of what it would be like to live here. I think that was very different though, moving to Connecticut in, the late 60s, with civil rights still, very much in bloom. And, I think it was difficult. I think it was hard. And I think it was hard for my mother as well, because in the Philippines, she had a lot more help with 7 children. And then when she moved here, she had no help. It was just her. And my dad was out, trying to make a living for us. And I think it was a very hard thing. My parents, when I was in college, did go back to the Philippines, and I asked them, and I'm glad I asked them this. I said, "Are you glad you came to the States after seeing your friends?" And they did comment that they felt like their lives were less stressful here than had they stayed in the Philippines, and that a lot of their friends looked like they aged, sort of more than they had, I think, just because of the stresses of living there. But my father said yes, and my mother said no. So it was really interesting how they each had a different take on that decision to leave in 1967.
And when they arrived in Connecticut, was your family able to find a Filipino community?
That's a great question. So there was a Filipino community, and I think my father, who was a great leader, he was instrumental in starting an organization called Filipinos of Connecticut. So we would meet regularly, and then we would have a barrio fiesta. We would participate in parades and different things. So we did have a community there. But, when I see my cousins in California, not as much as they do, or that they have now. And again, I'm sure that may have changed now that, sort of we live in a more of a global world where people are everywhere. But at that time, there really weren't a lot of Filipinos there. But my father found a way, and we found people, which was wonderful.
Yeah, that's really good. So within that kind of community, did you celebrate any like traditional holidays or cultural customs that you maybe still celebrate now?
Again, I think we just did the barrio fiesta, which was big. I think, I learned how to do the tinikling and the candle dance. But no, I think it was pretty Americanized, I think, though, too. So yeah, so not, I think the food, of course, is always celebrated. And it's pretty wonderful now that there are Filipino restaurants in Houston, that it's sort of like, seeing Filipino recipes in the New York Times. It's kind of, wonderful to see that, our food and culture are being celebrated.
Do you have a favorite Filipino restaurant in Houston?
Oh gosh, that's tough. So there are different kinds of restaurants. I think Flippin' Patties is more sort of like fusion burgers. That's sort of the first one that I loved. And then Max's Fried Chicken is here in Little Manila, which is great. But I also like Be More Pacific on Yale in the Heights. It's pretty fantastic. And if you want to go there on a Friday night and sing karaoke, it's pretty great. But also, I think that the Soy Pinoy that's in the new Post building, have you been there yet? It's pretty fantastic. Oh, you must go. And there's a wonderful rooftop garden that at night you have this really great view of downtown. So it's pretty wonderful to go there.
Well, that sounds really beautiful.
Yeah, it's really great.
Moving on kind of to education a little. So
Sure.
you studied photography at the University of South Florida. So what made you want to go to Florida, and also what drew you to photography as a medium?
So when I was 10, my family moved to Florida. So I initially did not want to do photography. I thought I wanted to be a newscaster like Connie Chung. And I had a boyfriend who had traveled a lot, and I kind of wanted to do that. So I started waiting tables, and I saved up enough money to go to Europe and a backpacking trip with a friend. And when I was there, I'll never forget, I was in Florence. The light that was coming into the window was just so beautiful. And I think my laundry was hanging, and I photographed it. And again, this is on film, so I didn't know what the image looked like until a month later when I was home and I got it processed. And I saw that image and I was like, wow, that's the power of photography. So I switched my major that fall to photography, and never looked back. And, I think as a photo teacher too, I think there's an old adage that students take photography classes in order to see themselves. And I think I didn't see myself, in our culture growing up a lot in the 70s. And maybe in the late 80s, it started to come. But, here we are now in 2023, and representation is big. Just with all that's been happening, just even in the Oscars with Michelle Yeoh winning, what that does to my heart when she says, for all the boys and girls who look like me, it's a pretty powerful thing that just happened this month, so, my work, I think, did start delving into sort of how I was seen. And it's, I think it has stayed with me, and again, it's changing. Yes, definitely. The culture has changed, but we're not there yet. So did that answer your question?
Yes.
About, yes. Okay.
And I know you mentioned that like your father and maybe one of your brothers were into photography. Were your parents supportive of your decision to major in that?
My parents were pretty great. They let me choose what it is that I wanted to do. I think at first when I did switch majors, there was a question about, well, can you get a job in that? What are you doing? And I just said, I think I really just want to do this. So I think they both just said, okay, go for it. But on my trip this is funny, on my trip to Europe, my mother was not pleased that I was going to go by myself with just another girlfriend. So she had me take them out to dinner and tell my father. And of course, my father was like, that's wonderful, you should go. So it was sort of just this push-pull. And she's like, I can't believe you're saying that she can go do this thing. But he trusted me and I think knew my abilities. So it was pretty wonderful that he did that.
Yeah, that's good that they had that trust in you. So at USF,
Yes.
how big was your photography studio, and like were you close with your studio mates?
Yes. So, and I always tell my Photo 1 students this, you never forget your first photo class, because I think it really opens up your world and how you see, and changes the way you see things. I mean, in terms of light, in terms of line, just in terms of structure, formal structure, composition. And I'm still in touch with some of my friends from my Photo 1 class. It wasn't a very huge photo program at USF at the time, but it's pretty magical to learn how to process your own film and to be in a dark room and to see an image develop in the developer tray. So I think we all kind of sense that magic together. So I think it really kind of connected us. One thing though that I do remember is I graduated in 1989, and the first digital class came to USF the semester I graduated. And I was just like, I'm never doing that. That's not real photography. And then, of course, when I get to graduate school, I take one digital class and I learn Photoshop 4.0. And I think, oh my God, this is life-changing. I can't believe it. I can't wait to do more. So never say never.
Yes. And how was graduate school like compared to USF?
It was harder and easier, I guess. to put it in a sentence. It's harder in the fact that you get to do what you want to do, but it's also easier in the fact that you get to do what you want to do and go from there. But I'm kind of glad that I went to undergrad. I sort of lived a little life. I had a couple kids, and then I went back to graduate school because it wasn't just straight through. I think I was, you know, ready to not to just sort of be in my art, and I think I needed it at that time too. So it was pretty wonderful also just to be in Houston. I mean, as a photographer, Houston is absolutely amazing. I'll never forget my first month in Houston, moving here from Los Angeles, that I went to the Houston Center for Photography, and they actually led me to Rice University to the community darkroom. And I'll never forget, every month I would go to the police station, I would pay for my card to get reactivated, and I could let myself in the building and use the darkroom whenever I wanted. That was just spectacular that I had that access. And I was making work, and I was applying to graduate school at the time too. So it was perfect. So I'm very grateful to Rice University for having that space at that time when I needed it too. But back to Houston being great for photographers. Houston Center for Photography is amazing. The Museum of Fine Arts is amazing. And Tucker, the curator at the time, and the fact that PhotoFest, the biannual international festival, is here with the PhotoFest meeting place. I couldn't be in a better city being a conceptual art photographer. So I'm really grateful that we landed here in Houston.
That's awesome. Sounds like Houston is kind of a photography hub.
Absolutely. And I think, Houston, the art scene here is very welcoming. If you're an artist and you come in, you're not sort of seen as a threat. It's like, come on, bring it, let's see what you can do. And I remembered that feeling. So whenever I see a new artist coming to Houston, I try to welcome them as much as I can and share what information I have, or introduce them to somebody that, may help them with their art career, or getting a job, or finding a place to live, or where to eat. I think, Houston's pretty wonderful that way too.
That's great. It sounds like a really supportive community.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm really grateful. I'm really grateful for my art community. And, I've recently, just not recently, but it's been a few years that I joined the Filipino Filipinx Artists of Houston, that was started by my friend and artist Matt Manalo. And I'll never forget my first meeting. It was just to be in a room of not only artists, but they were Filipino artists, where I felt like my voice was just so singular. It just amplified being in that room. And it was very emotional for me too, to be there. And it's just, all the events that we put on, the meetings, and I'm an older artist too, I think, in the group too. So I try to share with the younger artists what I know, and if I can help them, they know they can rely on me too.
That's really great. How do you think like the diversity in Houston has affected your art?
That's a great question. I'm very proud that we are very diverse in the city. I noticed that when I go to other cities that aren't as diverse, I sense it, I feel it. And I feel comfortable here. I belong here. And, I think that we are lucky to have so many countries coming here. And I teach at the community college, all of the different countries. I think I just came from a meeting, and I think they said we teach students from over 103 countries. And it's pretty spectacular that we have each other, I think. And I think we, the diversity just makes the city that much greater. And I think people are noticing that, so they're moving here. I think, the boom that has happened in Houston in the past 10 years, just it being a big city, it being very cultural, it having a lot of restaurants, food, art, the opera, music, two great airports we can fly out of. I mean, it's pretty, and I think Houston, it's interesting. There are things about Houston, just as far as like preservation and history, right? That, they knock down any buildings. It's sort of the developer's kind of city, right? But on the other hand, it's like somebody can come here and reinvent themselves too. And, just work hard and meet people, I think it's pretty wonderful that way. And again, I think I've been here a long time. I moved here in 1994. So going on 30 years, I know a lot of people here. So I think I feel, and it's the longest place that my husband and I have ever lived. He was an Air Force brat, so he moved around quite a bit. And, so I think we consider ourselves Houstonians now. Because that's really where we're from, kind of, and when, we travel abroad, where are you from? We say Texas because that's what they'll know. Which is kind of strange to even think about that I'm, over in Italy and I'm saying, oh, I'm from Texas. But, but then I get the question. I did the Camino de Santiago last year. And I was with my American friend, and we would say we're American. And then I would get another question, where are you really from? And it's just sort of like, okay. And then my friend's like, why are you talking about being Filipino so much? I said, I'm not talking about it. People are asking me that, So, I mean, proud to say it, but it's just kind of funny. But it was also kind of interesting to be in Spain and to think about, my maiden name being Flores and my mother's maiden name being Rodriguez, and walking through Asturias, knowing that my great grandfather was from there. So it's kind of a neat thing to walk across Spain and to sort of have that weird connection with it too, coming from the Philippines.
Yeah, it's really cool. You said you're in Spain for, was it a festival or like an
No,
art?
so the Camino de Santiago is a pilgrimage walk. Sorry, I'm in a conference room at HCC and people keep walking in. It's okay.
No.
Okay. And I keep sort of pointing at them. No, I'm in here. The Camino de Santiago is a pilgrimage, and there are many different routes. And it's a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, which is a city that has this beautiful cathedral that has the remains of St. James. And I turned 55 last year, and I told some friends that I think I want to do this walk. I read about it in a book, and I still haven't seen the movie The Way, which everybody knows that about it from that movie, but I haven't seen that. It's a Martin Sheen movie. But I read this book, when was it? In 2018, called A Sense of Direction. And it was a gentleman who did 2 walking pilgrimages, one in Japan and then the Santiago, Camino de Santiago. And I just thought to myself, I want to do that one day. And when I turned 55, it's like, I want to do something to mark this year, as well as us coming out of COVID. And I said, I would love to just get up in the morning, and all I had to do that day is walk. So 2 of my friends did it with me, and we started in France and we crossed the Pyrenees, and we did several routes. We did the French route, and then because we wanted to be on the coastline, we switched to the northern route, and then we switched to the Primitivo, which is sort of the oldest route. And over 5 weeks, we walked over 500 miles across Spain. So when I look at a map now, at first when I did, I would look at it and then my feet would hurt. But now I just sort of think to myself, I walked. My body moved itself across that distance. And it's a pretty amazing feeling. And it was an amazing experience too. And it's funny, I mentioned my backpacking trip to Europe before, because it kind of felt like that, because my friends who went with me too, it was just sort of like, okay, what do we want to do today? Where do we want to eat? Where are we going to go? Where are we going to stay? So you kind of have to figure that out, right? Like when you travel. And we just had what we were carrying on our backs. And, knock on wood, we didn't have too many sort of, foot or knee issues. And, we would walk some days, over 20 miles. And it's just, and then we would go to bed, we would be exhausted, we'd go to bed, we'd wake up and say, okay, I'm ready to do it again. Just thinking at what point is going to be your breaking point. But I'm pretty proud of us that we did it, and myself, that I was able to just endure that. Granted, along the way, there are coffee shops too. There are, it's not just desolate land. They sort of have an infrastructure built into the different routes. So it's a pretty amazing thing to do. And I encourage anyone who's interested in doing it to definitely go do it.
Wow, 500 miles.
Yeah.
That's like a very tough but very beautiful and rewarding experience.
Right. No, I'm so grateful that I was able to do that.
Yeah. So moving on a bit to your career.
Okay.
So it seems that photography was kind of your first main medium, since you studied it both in college at USF and then also at U of H for your master's program.
Yes.
But also starting from 2000, you started making incredible installations all over the world. So
Yes.
would you say that your main medium now is photography, physical art, or like a blend of the two?
I think it's a blend of the two. It's a great question though, too, as far as how I started as a photographer, and sometimes how I get introduced as a photographer. Then I have to qualify, well, what I do, is it really straight photography? It's not just taking an image and printing it and then putting it up on the wall in a frame. I think of, what photography meant for me was an image, but I think that flat two-dimensional image was never enough, because I think I wanted it to say more than just this. I wanted it to occupy space. I wanted it to become three-dimensional. So it did start off with me cutting up a photograph and printing it on transparency film, and then bending it to where it looked like a three-dimensional butterfly, or pair of shoes, whichever you saw. And I think I like that play, I think, within my work that still exists, with taking two parts, right? Making it one, and thinking it's one thing, but it's something else, which I think just sums up sort of my identity too, in a nutshell, right? I think people meeting me and then, oh, your English is very good, oh, you grew up here. I think that to exist as a hyphenated American, a Filipino American, right? That I have a foot in both. So it's kind of interesting too, that I have a foot in analog photography and a foot in digital photography too. And then now I think it's crossing over into installation artwork and more sculptural. And I think, that old adage that those who can't teach, I think that those who can teach, because if you really want to know something, you have to learn it to teach it. So I'm doing a lot of VR with my students right now, because we have amazing technology labs at HCC, Houston Community College, that I want to put that technology in the hands of my students. So I'm learning it quite a bit, and I'm seeing how that may shape my artwork going forward as well. So I'm interested in that. And the new work, the piece that's up at the Moody Center project wall right now, is 3 dimensions. It's using 3D printing. It's using CT scans of my own bones, which, symbolically, I really love that. It's sort of an internal part of me now that's external. that can symbolize many things for other people. It's about a wish. It's about a wishbone. It's about sort of, I think, thinking about, all that my parents hoped for in moving us to the United States. It's a symbol for so many things. And I really love where it's going, and I really love the installation at the Moody Project Wall, and love that Molly Everett, the curator there, asked me to work with the Rice students on that project.
Yeah, I'm taking a class at the Moody right now, so I always pass under it.
Oh, great. Oh, that makes
yeah. So for that installation, could you kind of describe the significance of wishbones, and then also, as you mentioned, kind of the connection between bird migration and human migration?
Sure. So ever since I was a little girl in Connecticut, I would lay on the ground and watch the birds fly, and just sort of seeing the murmurations and the shapes that they would take in the sky just has always fascinated me. And I was reading Rebecca Solnit's book, Recollections of My Non-Existence, and she mentions that she dreams about flying. And it reminded me that I do too. And I think that's always been sort of a wish that I could physically fly. And in my dreams, I just sort of jump up, and it's like I'm swimming, and then I can go up or down or move myself. And I was thinking about, if I could really actually fly, I would need what birds have, which aren't necessarily wings, but I would need the strength in my chest to move them, which is a furcula or a wishbone. And the analogous bones in the human body are our collarbones. So I asked my doctor, hey, and I made a mock-up. I want to make this, but I want to make it of my own bones. Can I get a CT scan done? And she said no. And I was like, I'm paying for it. I'm not going to run it through insurance or anything like that. And then a week later, I think she had a change of heart and just said, okay, go ahead. Here's the thing. So I was able to get my scans of my bones, and then model them into my own wishbone. What would be my own wishbone if I were to actually fly? That would be in my chest. And I think in terms of thinking about it as sort of birds in flight, but it's also thinking about everything that's happening in the world right now too, with people moving, and sort of, like I said, the global existence that we all have. I mean, even, for spring break, I flew to Italy. In one day I'm in Italy, the next day I can come home. I mean, it's really kind of spectacular that we actually do get to fly, and I heard something before I went on that trip that was talking about, to help you sort of not get cranky while you're flying. Think of what a miracle it is that you can fly. And it's true. It is. It's a pretty spectacular thing. And it's a very sort of surreal thing when you are in one country one day, and then, 12 hours later, you're in another country across the ocean. So back to the piece. Anyway, but it's all about flight. I mean, I think it is a pretty amazing thing that I think we take for granted sometimes too, that our bodies can move to different places, that my body can walk across Spain. So I think it's also about agency too. And I think, I'm very fortunate that my parents had the choice to come, because I know at this time it's really difficult. And, we're seeing it happening, and I hate to bring up something horrible, but just what happened at the detention center on the border last week. People are dying trying to get to this country, and, they're just wanting a better life for their families, for their children. And, another part of the piece that is migrating and flowing through the Moody project wall are the stories that I'm collecting. I think we all have a story. All our families have a story about how we got here. But also, you as college students are migrating, right, to other positions, to other places. So it's not just about the migration from one country to another. It's about our own movement. You know, and I think a migration can happen within your mind too, right? It could be a mindset. It could be how you see yourself, how you view yourself. So those stories are being collected now until Earth Day. And then on Earth Day, there will be a procession to the Rice Holistic Garden where the stories will be composted. And then in September, once they've gone through the composting cycle, there'll be a plant giveaway so that our words and our stories will grow things. You know, and I think symbolically, what I love about that is that we as immigrants, we as people who move, we fortify the ground, right? We make the ground better, we make the ground more fertile, and we make this country better. So I think that that's the message that I really would like for people to take away from the piece. And I think to be proud also of their migrations, and to own them. And the sharing of them, I think, is wonderful. I think it is, I notice when I see people sharing, it is sort of this cathartic thing that happens. I think, and it just, when we read each other's stories and we learn about one another, then I think that creates an empathy. And then can we move forward to a possible, as Frantz Fanon says, a collective catharsis, you know, toward feeling better and feeling united, just by that act of sharing, and empathizing and taking in other people's experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. I really love how like the installation kind of comes full circle and how there are so many different layers to migration. I really love that.
Yes, thanks.
Yeah. Another one of your like swarm pieces, the A-leaf swarm. I think
Yes,
so like really beautiful. And I love that you used a voting system to decide which shoes to make.
yes.
So did you make all 1,000 of the shoe butterflies out of the top choices for shoes, or did you also add in some like other shoes?
No, I put 10 pairs of shoes forth. I talked to community leaders and I talked to a lot of students at A-Leaf to help me pick the 10 shoes that would be voted on. And then the top 5 that were chosen were the shoes that were made into the printed dichroic acrylic, then that were bent into the pieces that hang in the A-Leaf Community Center right now. I'm very proud of that piece. You know, that piece was really born about 20 years ago when I finished graduate school and I was doing work on my Philippine American identity and thinking about fashion and shoes and objectification and gender conditioning. And, you know, my daughters, I think, brought me to that work. They were, how old were they then? They were 5 and 6 at the time, and would wear my high heels pigeon-toed. So I started photographing the shoes that way. And when I started gridding them on the computer and on the studio wall, they started looking like bugs and butterflies. So again, I'm very haptic with my work. I have to do something to the photograph. So I started cutting them out, and then I thought to print them on transparency film because that's something within photography that I've always loved. As well as it having the ability to project color onto the wall when the light shines through them. So again, the migration has just always been part of my work. And that's where they started migrating on the wall. And, you know, when people see them, they think of, oh, they look like the Filipino Islands or the Philippine Islands, or they look like land masses, or, you know, so I like the fact that it's both, you know, it could be something in the sky, but it's also in the land. So it's, the technology has caught up, I think, with the idea, because I think I really wanted that idea, that the idea of the shoe butterflies to occupy space, to be like real things, right? I mean, I think it's, again, that idea of going from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions just with a fold. And, you know, with laser cutting and with the printing technologies that are available now, I could not have made this piece before, cutting acrylic by hand. So I'm pretty excited about sort of the technologies now, and how they're affecting my work. I mentioned VR earlier too. I'm doing 3D printing. I took a CT scan of my bone. I'm able to sculpt that. It's pretty exciting, I think, too. And I think as a photographer too, I think I've been open to that, you know, I think because photo was sort of the new medium, you know, within the art departments for so long, you know, and a lot of, I think, these new medias fall under the guise of photo departments, because it's sort of like, well, where else are we going to put it? Or they create a new media department at universities. So it's kind of interesting how that works. But no, I'm really proud of that piece. I love that it's at the A-Leaf Community Center. I'm very proud that the A-Leaf community had a part in it. And the city of Houston, MOCA, the mayor's office of cultural affairs, supported that work. And not just of my work, but there were 2 other women-led groups whose art pieces are in that building that I'm just very proud to have my work alongside theirs. It's the Red Thread Collective, and Fallon McCallick.
That's really cool. So I know you mentioned when you were little, you kind of looked up to Connie Chung as like a role model. Do you hope that like children will also look up to you in the same way?
Sure. You know, Emily, one thing I love when I walk into a class, people see my name and it's Bennie Ansell. They probably think I'm some white dude. And then I walk into the class and they're sort of taken aback. And I think my students of color, I think it makes a difference. I think for them to see me and for them to say at the end of my class, I want to be a college professor like you. You know, yes, she is who I saw. You know, that is what I thought I could do, because that is the only other person who looked like me that was out in sort of the cultural world that I was seeing, you know, at the time, you know, and, you know, the stereotypes and all of that were still very, very present in the 70s, you know, and yes, that's changing still. I went to a talk the other night for the Rothko Chapel, and Carrie Mae Weems, this Black photographer who I consider one of my art ancestors, who, when I found her work when I was in graduate school, I just was like, yes, that this is sort of what I want to address as a woman of color in America. She and Lorna Simpson, I think, were 2 of my favorite artists at the time, who really inspired me to be more conceptual, to use text in my work. But she said this thing the other day, and it has stayed with me, in terms of talking about sort of race and what's going on in our country. She called it the changing same. And I thought, oh my gosh, you know, when I was in graduate school, you know, 20 plus years ago, I was making work about race, and sometimes I was told, we're past this. We don't need to be addressing this anymore. But here we are, you know, 20 plus years later, finally addressing it, like really addressing it. And, you know, I'm just glad there's an awareness of it. I'm glad that Michelle Yeoh won the Oscar, and to say something like that. And I love the fact that, you know, this is kind of funny. I noticed this on Instagram, that Brandy, the Cinderella Brandy, that they're coming out with sort of a redo of her as an older parent with her Filipino husband, Prince Charming. But I sent that to my daughters, but I'm really grateful that they had women of color to look up to too, just in their lifetime, you know. And I think that that means a lot to me, you know, that they're able to see women of color as beautiful, that there wasn't this sort of just whitewashed sense of beauty. I mean, I think we're still fighting that. I think today, you know, there's so much about that. And there's so much relearning, I think, that people have to do. I mean, I think, even within different cultures, I think how dark you are too says something. I think I used to get chastised by my mother for being out in the sun when I was a child because I would get too dark. I didn't understand that, and then of course I equated that with it being bad. So I think, I would love to show children that they can do anything, and I tell my students that the sky's the limit. You are limiting yourself if you think you can't do something. So figure out how to do it. There's nothing to be afraid of, but you got to work hard, and you can't sort of just be in a cocoon and think somebody's going to discover you. You have to put yourself out there and own who you are and be proud of it and know that you can do it. So.
Right. And kind of related to that, so if your children were to watch this interview in the future, what is like one message you would want to tell them?
My own children? Oh gosh, you're gonna make me cry. No. I asked, so you sent me the questions ahead of time about what did my daughters think about me being an artist.
Yeah.
So I think as a working mother, sometimes you always feel guilty when you're working because you should be with your children, or when you're with your children that you should be working. I asked my daughters that question when I received them from you, and one daughter said that me being an artist has shown her that art is everywhere. I think kind of like my parents showed me too, that, find beauty in everything. And I think my other daughter said that, she never sort of felt like it took me away from them. I think she loved the fact that I was an artist, and, we didn't have any family here. So she said when we would go to art openings, they had this extended family of artists that sort of became their aunts and uncles and watched them grow up. So that was pretty beautiful, and then I do have grandchildren now. My daughter said that my grandson's face lights up whenever she tells him we're going to go see one of Lola's art pieces now. So that I think that's probably wonderful for him to see that I play still. I mean, it's my artwork is a form of play for me. And, and I think for a lot of artists, I think you have to let your adult self go sometimes in order to spend that time in the studio to do these things. And I think it's a sort of, and I think artists feel this way too. It's like you're giving yourself this time to be creative and to be yourself. So yeah, I hope they're proud of me. I know they are. I think that they're both kind of amazing too. I think they're both very, very mindful of art. And my oldest daughter, I'll never forget, she's an old soul. Her name is Thora. We were at a museum one time and she looked at an art piece and she was thinking what I was thinking conceptually about it, which was beyond her years. And I just kind of looked at her like, oh my gosh, you saw that. I was like, that's, but it's pretty great. But I mean, I think that also speaks to the visual language of art coming through into somebody that can come out in words. I'm a visual artist. I'm not a writer. I'm not great at public speaking. Sometimes I just don't feel very comfortable doing that. I say what I need to say in a visual form. But anyway, I'm very proud of my daughters. I love, the fact that they, got to witness me doing something I loved, because I think that encourages them too. And again, I had them, and what was great at U of H at the time, their preschool was on campus. So they went to school and I went to school, and then I would pick them up and then we would go home. So it was kind of a wonderful thing that I was able to do that with them at that time.
That's really amazing. Do you have any like family hobbies that you like to do?
We used to snowboard during spring breaks. I think our hobbies now are eating really good food. We like to eat a lot. I think just, I think post-COVID too, I think just being together, hanging out at the house, talking or taking my grandchildren to the park, is pretty wonderful. And, I'm just grateful that they're both here in Houston. And that we get to have family dinners and, they get to see my work. And it was a pretty proud moment for me to have my family at the A-Leaf opening. And again, the piece had been finished since July, but I had to kind of keep it hush until the city unveiled the piece. And that was a really proud moment for me, as well as the piece at the Moody Center. And I love the way the opening went at the Moody Center too, because I had people share their migration stories. So it was almost like they spoke to what my piece was about to them, as well as Mark Armenia's writing on Rudolfo Hewlin Fernandez, who was the first Asian American student to graduate from Rice. And it was pretty spectacular to have him as a current undergraduate speak about the very first Filipino American, Asian American at Rice. So I really love that.
And do either of your children, do they also do art?
So as much as I encourage them, my oldest daughter, Thora, is an amazing photographer, and she did photography in high school. And I think she worked at the photo lab at her university at KU for the first 2 years. But then I think she decided that she had the teacher gene, and she graduated with an education degree. However, she's now at U of H in the graduate program. She's about to graduate in May, and she is getting a master's in social work. So I think she feels like she can make a difference in children's lives that way too. And yeah, she's pretty, they're both pretty amazing sort of interior designers. I think they get that from me. I move furniture around a lot, which is kind of the joke within our family that we always do. And my daughter Zoe, they're both very much into fashion. And my daughter Zoe is a lawyer. However, she's an amazing creative writer. So I think one day she might stop lawyering and get back to that. Maybe that's just my wish, but we'll see.
That's great. It sounds like the creative gene was kind of just everywhere.
Yes, yes.
And finally, the last two questions, sort of like a joint question.
Okay.
So first, how do you identify yourself ethnically? So this could be like Filipino or Filipino American, or and then also, do you plan to visit the Philippines anytime soon?
Very good question. I consider myself to be a Filipino American, is what I say. And that question has always daunted me because I have never been back. And it's a funny question because I would go back and I would probably feel like it was more foreign to me than more connected to me. And I know that that's weird to say, but I feel my Filipino roots when I'm with my cousins in California. I feel my Filipino roots when I hear Tagalog spoken. All of my uncles and aunts have left the Philippines. I think I have a couple cousins that live there now. And the cousin who was my father's goddaughter, her name is Christina, she passed away last fall. She and I were planning to go, and it just really breaks my heart that I was not able to go back with her because I wanted her to show me. And my father was an architect, so there are some buildings that probably still exist that he had a hand in Manila, that I would like to see. My daughter Zoe is encouraging me to go back, so I would definitely like to do that. And it's funny how my mother doesn't want me to go back because she thinks that they'll hear that I'm an American and they'll kidnap me. But I mean, I know that's not the case, but still. I really wish that our parents taught us Tagalog. I was talking to my daughter about this the other day because she was talking to one of her friends whose parents didn't teach her Spanish, and how she felt like she was at a disadvantage then when she's with her family, and I yes, I'm going to learn Tagalog. And I also want to learn Italian. But I think they were just worried about us assimilating. And, they heard from other friends that when they spoke Tagalog at home, that their children were held back in school. So I think they were kind of concerned about that. But again, parents make the best decisions they make when they're tasked with something to do. So, again, I don't blame them for that. But that is a wish that I have. But I do feel comfortable when I'm around Tagalog and hearing it and hearing my cousins speak it, and then having them speak it to me and I understand what they're saying. It's a pretty wonderful thing. But yes, I would like to go back, but I think I don't know if you've heard of the Kalinga tribe and the women with the tattoos, the older women with the tattoos. You have to climb up a mountain to go there to get a tattoo. I would like to do that one day. And I think that would feel kind of amazing to go back to my country of origin, and then to literally mark it on my body. I think would be a wonderful thing to do. If you're on Instagram, Vogue Philippines, sort of the main woman that's sort of left of that tribe, she's on the cover. So definitely something to look at.
Yeah, that would be a really amazing thing to do. Do you know what you would want to get tattooed, or is it like?
Well, you know what she said in the article, which I think rings true to me now too, now that I have a granddaughter. Her symbol now is like 3 dots. So it's one for her, one for her niece, or her grandniece, who is her protege, and then she has one other person she's training. So I think it is sort of this beautiful continuity of generations of knowledge of, and I think some of those tattoos that Filipinos get, it's about their story, and it's it on their skin. I think there's something that's very beautiful about that happening. I think, and then as being also a record that's being kept, which I think is really pretty beautiful.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's all the questions I have planned for today, but do you have anything else you'd like to add?
No, thank you for inviting me. It's a big honor, I think, to be part of the Asian American Archive at Rice. And no, I'm just grateful, and I'm grateful that my piece is up at the Moody Center too. Again, I feel like I've come full circle from when I moved to Houston and I started working in the darkroom at Rice, and now my piece is showing there.
Right. Yeah. As I said, it's very beautiful. I walked.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with me. And have a nice rest of your day.
Okay, you too. All right, bye, Emily.